This is a panel that's entitled Civil Society Under Fire, and we'll try to have some fireworks. Although the numbers are relatively small, that doesn't mean we can't be very passionate. In fact, maybe we can be even more passionate. So it came as a surprise to me when Karen, one of our panelists, pointed out during the planning session that we're all lawyers. All four of us up here are lawyers. That was not at all by design. But I guess it's not a coincidence in the sense that the theme for the panel is human rights. And there is a connection, of course, between human rights and law. Now, framing it in the context of the Skoll World Forum, there's been much talk about systems. And so I would simply point out that, of course, a legal system is a system. And more aspirationally, we might even sometimes call it a justice system. But I want to talk about system failure, because human rights is also a system, the international human rights system, and it is essentially a system that was designed out of system failure. As you all know, in Hitler's Germany, Hitler was elected by democratic election. His policies were implemented very consistently and rigorously through law, but it resulted in a cataclysmic war and in genocide. And the response of some very entrepreneurial people, entrepreneurial people with access to power, was to create a system, the international human rights system. That's what gave birth to the international human rights system, was recognizing that system failure and trying to correct for it. And unfortunately, nowadays, many of us look around the world and we see system failure. That's something that I think we very much feel. But I want to put that into the context of this panel, which is about civil society. Last night, there was an excellent film that I hope you all saw. I was there, called Bending the Arc. Very, very well-made documentary film. And it tells a story, and the story it tells, the metaphor of the title is clearly about the well-known saying that the arc bends towards justice, but the arc does not bend by itself. And that film does a great job of illustrating how that arc sometimes bends. In the case of the film, it bends through the efforts of Paul and Jim, and not just them, but their partners and their patients, and a number of individuals who make that arc bend. That's what local human rights groups and civil society organizations do. They do that every day. We can think of them in a way as the last mile of the international human rights system, and they are essential. But they also have a built-in vulnerability. For 25 years now, civil society organizations have mushroomed around the world, driven by some global trends. But there is a built-in vulnerability that most of them share, because almost all, in most countries, almost all NGOs receive almost all of their funding from outside the country. And that creates a vulnerability that lately has been exploited by politicians, basically, by governments and politicians who consider NGOs to be a nuisance sometimes in the policies they want to be implemented or in maintaining power. And the vulnerability is that it becomes very easy to label those NGOs that are receiving foreign funding as being foreign agents. In fact, they're not foreign. In fact, these NGOs are, as we know very well from here, because we meet many social entrepreneurs from all around the world. Sometimes those social entrepreneurs are running NGOs, sometimes not, but they look like NGO people all over the world. They're local. They are local founders of organizations. They have local agency. They have their own agency. They are not foreign agents of anyone else. But because of following the money backwards, it's very easy to stigmatize and label those organizations as being foreign. And worse, it's a very contextualized phenomenon. So in some countries, you'll find that NGOs are being labeled as foreign agents, especially in places where there are strong memories of the Cold War, and the word foreign agent has a certain connotation. They'll be labeled as corrupt briefcase NGOs, or they'll be labeled as undermining local economic priorities, or rather national economic priorities. They might be labeled as subverting national values, representing some cosmopolitan concerns about the other. There's many labels, but it has become a very common phenomenon. And there's a sort of a potent combination that has become almost viral in its spread of smear campaigns of one sort or another, coupled with very technical regulatory means, driven at least in justification by legitimate priorities. Priorities about countering terrorism or trying to combat money laundering. So globally approved regulatory models that are used after a smear campaign is softening up the general public to be supportive of those efforts. And this has, as I said, this has been an almost viral phenomenon that's reached near epidemic proportions. In the last 5 years, there are 70 countries in the world that have passed restrictive laws controlling NGOs of one sort or another. 1/3 of the laws have, some 40 of them, have been about restricting foreign funding. And it's not the, there were laws before 5 years ago. Some of them are sort of, in India, for example, involve amending a law that's been on the books for a very long time. But, so it's not completely new, but the pace of new efforts to develop these restrictive frameworks is something very new, the very rapid pace. So the purpose of this panel is not to dwell on that. There's been a lot of discussions in many different forums about this trend, and it's now increasingly recognized as a trend that's not going away. The purpose of the panel is to think about, what can we do about it? What are the solutions? What do we need to do to address this sad state of affairs? And that's what I've asked the panel. The panelists and I have all collaborated on talking about different ways of having a conversation about what can be done about it. And we'll proceed with a few questions to elicit their respective points of view. And then we'll open it up to all of you for your comments. So Poonam, I'm sure you agree that civil society is integral to the human rights system. Yeah. And of course, in part, not only does civil society help the human rights system to affect its purposes, but it also, the human rights system is there to protect civil society too. It's a reciprocal relationship. And yet, that seems increasingly not to be working. So what can be done?
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to speak on this panel. And great to be part of such a great and diverse panel. Well, apart from the fact that we're all human rights lawyers, so maybe not that diverse. Before I sort of go into solutions, I just wanted to touch on a couple of problems. Not that we don't have enough on the table, but just to kind of give you a sense, I think, of what somebody like me, or other human rights funders, are kind of seeing the world and seeing the limitation of those sort of strategies and what do we do next. So I think, first, as you were saying, those traditional strategies aren't working. And, to simplify the problem, there's a couple of issues there. There's the crisisness of the effectiveness of the human rights framework and system. You have this sort of proliferation of international, regional institutions, national level institutions from which human rights was supposed to kind of trickle down and turn into meaningful rights at the local level. And often, we haven't seen that happening. We've seen sort of pragmatism ceded to sort of sticking to principles. We've seen laws passed but not implemented. But the other sort of challenge is the human rights framework was also supposed to be about a set of common values that are quite moral at their heart. And what you're seeing, a lot of people have been speaking about this for the last couple of years, but you see it really kind of accentuated by the election of Donald Trump in the US, is the kind of idea of the end of shame. And the kind of end of the idea, I'm not saying it is the end, but potentially the end of an idea of universal values and universal rules. And instead, what governments are going to sort of be shifting towards is sort of pursuing their interests based on transactions, on the kind of art of the deal, on what's they are sort of proposing or in the best interests of their country. And that's also being couched very powerfully, as Ed, you sort of described, in a number of countries, including in Russia, across Central Asia, elsewhere, in the language of sovereignty and nationalism. So you're really seeing kind of local people buying into that sort of interpretation of what's happening. Second, you've got the sort of crisis of accountability. So I think, seeing across the world, both in autocracies, but increasingly in democracies, a resistance of power to being held to account. And what do you do when the checks and balances, those institutions and those pillars of democracy that were supposed to hold power to account, you have depleted political opposition, you have judiciary under attack, you have media being co-opted or controlled or stifled, and we've got civil society coming under attack. Who's left to hold power, be it in the form of government, be it in the form of corporations, be it in the form of far-right movements? Who's going to hold those powers to attack? So my sort of suggestion is sort of looking at two particular things. One, I think it's kind of the need to look local, which is not giving up on the international and not giving up on the regional, but in terms of creating local ownership and legitimacy of human rights values. Certainly we as funders are going to look at who are the actors we need to support at the local level. And maybe sort of, 5 or 10 years ago, we might have said, well, actually, maybe people aren't that engaged. People were almost talking about the end of politics and the end of history, and we all were sort of occupying this sort of central middle ground. And we can see just through the rise of protests. So Carnegie Endowment have done sort of very interesting mapping. I think there are 60 countries in which there have been major protests in the last few years. This is a new phenomenon, and it's here to stay. So you see sort of anger, and you see disruption, and you see a desire for civic engagement. So how do you engage that in a constructive way? Because the reality is a lot of that protest has ultimately been disruptive and hasn't resulted in social justice and human rights outcomes. And how do you also support individuals? I mean, I think, in very restrictive contexts, who's left to hold government to account? It's going to be individuals, it's going to be citizens. So how do you sort of support civic engagement and a kind of much more sort of deepened form of democracy? So just to give you a very quick example of the challenge ahead. So at the Council of Europe, a number of INGOs were lobbying for a resolution on the right to support of civic participation. And that negotiations and sort of advocacy for that resolution was stifled. I'd sort of like you to sort of guess, which is the country that blocked the idea that citizens have a right to participate in their democracy day in, day out, and not just at elections. So I don't know, if you have sort of any quick ideas, who do you think would be the top candidates in a European context?
Albania.
Albania, any others? I think I heard something. Poland. It was Norway. It was Norway that said, your job is to elect us, and it's up to us what we do the following 4 years. So that's the situation that we're in. It's not, I mean, Hungary and Poland are doing this, but that sort of idea of what do we mean by democracy, I think that's kind of goes to the heart of this. And then the second point I'll just say, put it briefly, is Ed, you were talking about the NGO model and the kind of legitimacy and that disconnect between NGOs and their constituencies. And the reality are there are lots of really great, talented advocacy litigation groups out there. We fund many of them through the Trust. But I think the question we as funders have been asking ourselves over the last couple of years is, how meaningful is their impact? And what role have we played as funders in deciding whose agenda is progressed on the ground? In many cases, it's been a donor agenda. The vast majority of funding that goes to human rights democracy work is government money and private foundations. But it's also whose definition of success and impact are those groups working to? And the reality is, in the vast majority of cases, it's the agenda set by the donors. And so one of the things I think we really have to look at are new models of that relationship between funders and NGOs, but NGOs and communities, and where they get the resources to do their work. So that's going to look at new models that will address and support greater legitimacy, greater resilience. So that means getting more funding from local sources. So it's not so easy for governments to say, this is foreign money. And then finally, money that will support the freedom of those local leaders to respond to local agendas.
Okay, thank you, Poonam. So David, you're a lawyer. I'm not going to emphasize that point too many more times.
And I just had the horrifying realization we're dressed almost identically. So, other than the glasses in the 2-day scruff, we are.
There you go. So we're of a mold, so therefore, since we look alike, I know that you must think like me too. And a lawyer generally sees a human rights problem and has a certain set of tools and techniques that they use to solve that problem. But you haven't done that.
I tried.
Okay. Well, we'll hear about that in a second. You haven't done that. And we heard at one of the plenaries, we heard Hamdi talking about business being a solution. That seems to be what you think too. So tell us about that and how you've dealt with the trafficking issue in Asia.
Yeah, so basically, as Ed said, I started as a lawyer. I guess I'm still technically a lawyer, a reformed lawyer. And as a young man growing up in the southeast part of the United States, right in the shadow of Martin Luther King's Ebenezer Baptist Church, I often asked myself as a young man, I am middle class, I am white, I am in the South. Would I, if I lived 300 years earlier, would I have been willing to be a slave owner, right? And just I guess a natural question that a young boy, I don't know why, I clearly had a strange mind even at that point. But in 2007, I moved to Hong Kong with a law firm and realized it was not a hypothetical question. But it was, in actual fact, there are more slaves living in the world right now today than there ever have been in the history of humankind. And that was something that was very transformational from my kind of legal perspective, because again, I thought this was a problem we had solved, and I certainly did not expect it, or wouldn't expect to see it so openly in a modern economy like Hong Kong. And so I was practicing law full time, and using my pro bono time, I focused on these types of issues that I cared very deeply about: UNHCR, refugee asylum representation, foreign migrant worker type of representation, human trafficking type stuff. And every day felt like I was beating my head against a very painful brick wall. And after 2 years working as a lawyer full-time in Hong Kong, joined the business faculty at the University of Hong Kong. That is where I teach now and have been for the past 8 years, and tried to diversify my approach to this type of problem solving. I call myself a modern day abolitionist, and what I essentially try to do is create market-based solutions to complex regional problems. And as I was working with an NGO, and we know the typical NGO perspective, which is good, is helping that one lost lamb, sometimes at the expense of the 99, right? And so my perspective, thinking about it logically from a market-based solution, was, well, wait a minute, what about the 99? And so I actually, in a fit of very misplaced anger, once started yelling at one of the NGOs that I was supporting, saying, what are you doing? You've been doing this for 20 years. Why aren't you trying to stop this problem? Why are you just putting your finger on this gaping wound? And again, it was misdirected anger, but that was the way my perception started changing. I said, okay, once I understand the problem, we're going to figure out a market-based solution to overcome or alleviate that problem. So we created the Fair Employment Agency. 80% of human trafficking is labor trafficking, and this is especially true within Asia. And out of that labor trafficking, the vast majority of that is facilitated by a legal process whereby, imagine you are a young woman Let's say you're a young mother, 25 years old, living in Guimaras, a beautiful island, the mango capital of the Philippines, and in an attempt to provide an education and a roof over the head for your children, you leave your small community, which you have never left before, and you want to travel to a place like Hong Kong and be a migrant domestic worker. Now, what that typically means is you're going to be essentially a housemaid, right? 10% of Hong Kong's working population are foreign domestic workers. That represents it's over 350,000 people, and that number is growing exponentially each year, and that is true across Asia. And so you go through the legal process, which legally you are required to receive government accredited training. It's called TESDA training. You then have to work with a local agency who then has a partner on your destination countryside, so a second agency, so that eventually you can find a job as a domestic worker. In this setting, because of the information asymmetry, as you can see from the numbers here, the average foreign domestic worker is charged anywhere from 5 to 10, sometimes 25 times the legal limit in placement fees. The agencies use these placement fees in order to line their own pockets, and when the domestic workers cannot pay these fees, which they inevitably cannot, the agencies very helpfully finance this with a friendly moneylender who is also a partner of theirs, who then charges them usurious and illegally high interest rates. They take their passports until they can pay those fees back, and they end up, on average, paying anywhere from 2 to sometimes 8 or even 12 months of their salary without receiving a dime. They have to work oftentimes up to a full year before they have paid off their debt. Now, they're not going to these set of circumstances unless they need that money to give to their family, which means they're taking on additional debt during that 6, 8, 12 months, which means they enter into a debt cycle without access to travel documents like a passport, and so they are perpetually in that cycle. So if there is physical, sexual, other type of violence or abuse against them, they're unable usually to leave that situation. So we did a very simple thing. This is the traditional, it's a very simple solution to a very complex problem. If the pressure point were these agencies, we decided to bypass these agencies, and we created the first ever social enterprise employment agency, as far as we know, anywhere, but certainly within Asia. It's called the Fair Employment Agency. We have eliminated the money lenders and the unethical agency and the fees they charge, and instead we follow the International Labor Organization's standard of charging 0 placement fees to domestic workers. And yet, for the past 3 out of 4 months, we're a profitable, ongoing entity that is with very expensive growth. We've gone from 1 employee to more than 22 full-time employees in the past 2 years. And we've entertained a lot of other kind of business types of solutions to this issue. So even in this kind of hyper-growth phase, we are thus far at least break even, if not profitable. And so we're looking at the ability to expand this model, to license this model, to franchise this model. And thankfully, because of our position, we're seen as a systems-based solution that is neutral, and therefore we become friends to everyone involved, which allows us, hopefully, to create a legal, ethical, and professional path to migration for workers.
Okay, so there we go. So that's a market-based solution to a human rights problem, although it happened to come from a lawyer. But you didn't need to be a lawyer to come up with that solution, and it has the virtue of not requiring outside resources. It's a completely, well, maybe you're not completely indigenous, David.
Now, if anyone has outside resources, we will take your money.
Yeah.
But thankfully...
well, and if the resources come in, then they're investment, and that's a different category.
It's growth capital.
So it's not based on foreign charitable funds, which is the model that's so much under attack all over the world. You meet a visionary individual with a passion for a social issue, and then you can easily help that person to scale up their efforts by directing them to charitable funds. That's not necessarily the model of social entrepreneurship, but it is a model that has been prevalent over the last 25 years that has created tens of thousands of advocacy organizations all over the world. Now, another alternative is well, I'm not going to steal her thunder, but there are other alternatives also that don't require setting up advocacy organizations. And Karen, you have a model that has had you working in some 40 countries around the world, working on very important human rights issues like the eradication of torture. And you use a model where there's a lot of international collaboration. Therefore, you must run into this trend of antagonism towards foreign-supported local efforts. So what does that look like from your vantage point?
First, I want to say thank you, and thank you to everyone here. It's actually nice that the room has become fuller as people are coming in. I sometimes feel that I sound like a Pollyanna because I say, you know, things have always been bad and always been good, and we can keep working towards it. But I think that that is actually the reality of the situation, particularly in the area that we work in. So we are looking at ending torture as an investigative tool in many developing countries by placing a lawyer early on in police stations and in courtrooms. And that's because, as Poonam mentioned earlier, there are many laws on the books. We've done a very good job of this. So there's, out of the 113 countries that torture, 93 of these countries all have laws on the books that say you have a right to a lawyer, right not to be tortured. The issue has really been that these laws are not implemented. And if you are picked up, and this affects the majority of the poorest of the poor, if you're picked up and you cannot afford a lawyer, the police will start breaking your fingers immediately because it is the cheapest form of investigation. So for us, our mission really is to end investigative torture and implement due process rights by placing lawyers early on. And the reason that I say it's always been challenging is because it's always been, I usually hate this word when governments say, but this is sensitive. I go, it's not sensitive. But the reality of it is that it is sensitive because we aren't going in and looking at one prisoner or 5 prisoners or coming in after the fact, but we are looking at what you described earlier as system change. We realize that in order for us to actually not cherry pick our cases of like this wonderful poster child or this person, if we want to in fact help the majority of people, and there's over 3 million people, it's something that happens on a daily basis for the majority of countries, we have to work together inside the system with one part of the system, which happens to be the government, in order to access the prisons, work with the police officers, and implement it. So I'd say that it's for us and for many of our partners, it's not that things haven't gotten worse. We've also seen people who have received larger jail sentences, some of our staff, one who's been killed. We've also seen some tensions. And at the same time, that actually has always been true since the year 2000. And it's been really, I'd say, the testament of the phenomenal creativity and resourcefulness of all of the lawyers and defenders on the ground who've always come up with different ways of doing it. So, I mean, I could remember even starting offices in one country, and I think we're taped, so I'm not going to mention specific countries. But in one of our initial meetings, the lawyer said, you know, everybody knows that we are often, we stand up in court and we say, my client's been tortured, it's against the law, and the next thing we know, we're in danger of being handcuffed, brought into jail, beaten until we're bloody, and then a confession taken of us saying, you know, we have obstructed justice. And they said to us, the only way that you can protect us is to go in and sign an MOU with the government, with the Ministry of Justice, so that as we stand up together, as we begin to implement this together, we can say, we're not doing anything illegal, as you see. You yourselves, you the Ministry of Justice, have signed this MOU. So from the very beginning, we started looking at how we form relationships with governments in order to protect the lawyers who are doing the very work which is part of the system. And I think that's a huge part of it, is that we recognize that, you know, if you're doing system change, it's going to be very tricky. Sometimes you're sort of walking a tightrope. And at the same time, if you're attacking one part of the system for system change, it's not going to be sustainable in terms of generations.
Okay, so thank you, Karen. Now, Poonam, we've just heard 2 different kinds of activities that are getting at the same problem that human rights lawyers are trying to get at, but in ways that your foundation hasn't typically supported, not the classic advocacy model of a human rights NGO. What do you think about these models? Are they enough? Are they transformative enough?
I mean, firstly, I kind of recognize the kind of innovation in terms of both of those models. And I think the reality is where you're particularly looking at very restrictive environments, we as funders or supporters of the human rights movement can't sit there and be purist and say, no, you know, your only position is to be antithetical to power. And one of those debates we are having is, you know, the role of supporting organizations that are able to engage with power in different ways, that can be pragmatic, that maybe work on issues that don't look so controversial, but actually are still leading to protection and change on the ground. Because if we sort of only operate at that sort of meta level, we're going to lose the people on the ground, the domestic workers, the people who are being tortured, and those protections aren't going to be in place. So I think that's sort of very valuable. But I think there's a limitation to sort of where pragmatism is going to get us. And I think, as I was sort of saying earlier, what you also see is sort of growing anger and rage and protest also taking place. And you know, alongside that sort of very practical hands-on work, demand for kind of large-scale sort of reform, and there are actors who are going to sort of engage in resistance and struggle. And in terms of us sort of fundamentally changing the model, we as funders are going to look at supporting actors that are coming up with ideas for new models, that are going to sort of be using a combination of protest and advocacy, but also, and I think here's the bridge between the two, who are able to engage with unlikely allies who are already in power. Because, you know, the reality is, although the world is looking increasingly polarized, we know there are many people sitting within corporations, within military, within intelligence, who also are worrying about, you know, where the world is heading at the moment. So just sort of a couple of examples of that, you know, Cambodia a couple of years ago, where you had the government cracking down on the right of unions to operate. And you had a whole coalition of garment and textiles companies who said, actually, for us to remain profitable, but in terms of maintaining our reputation, we're going to need to protect the role of unions to advocate on behalf of workers. And they challenged the Cambodian government. That then sort of took a step back. I mean, things have deteriorated since then. But kind of very interesting examples emerging of corporations saying we actually need rule of law and democracy and human rights to meet your goals and to meet our goals. In terms of sort of military security, I mean, we've seen it most recently with the lineup of senior military officials who said torture is not going to result in better security. So the sort of question is going to be, you know, how do you have that conversation between the activists and between power about sort of new solutions that come up with systemic change and new ideas about what we mean about development, around democracy, around security, and around human rights. And I think for us, we sort of see our role particularly in keeping open the space for plurality and dissent. So, you know, it's not our space as a human rights funder to fund particular social movements, but it's to sort of keep the space open for the people on the margins to be able to engage and question those in power by protecting the framework in terms of the right to dissent, the right to express your views, the right to sort of organize and mobilize. And I think that piece of work absolutely has to sit alongside this. I think the sort of final point I'd make in terms of just the foreign funding and our role and also recognizing our limitations. So when I was in Warsaw recently and speaking to a whole range of statesmen of the kind of civil society movement who'd been involved in activism with the Solidarity movement, so pre-1989. And they were saying, oh my God, things are so bad now, you know, what are we going to do? And I said, well, actually tell me, is it as bad as it was pre-1989? And they were like, no, actually, it's nowhere near as bad. And I said, well, you know, you know how to mount a long-term resistance. You know, you have the tools, and actually you have something that a lot of other people don't have, which is you have the memory to be able to share with the younger generation and say, this is what autocracy feels like, and this is how we can stop it. And those movements were not funded necessarily from the outside. They had political support from the outside, but if you look at the anti-apartheid movement, if you look at Solidarity, if you look at the struggle for independence at India, you know, none of those things ran to a log frame. They weren't funded by CEDA and USAID. You know, they were sort of indigenous movements that needed regional and international levels of support. And I think our role as funders is to keep the space open for those movements and that level of plurality, and keeping the space for a number of people to come together to be able to provide alternative solutions, and to make sure those movements remain resilient in the long term.
Okay, thanks. So David, you're running a business, but you're running a business in an area where, which is also occupied by a lot of community groups and advocacy groups and movements. And does that create tensions, and how do you resolve those tensions?
Yeah, so this is, so I am less involved in the day-to-day running of Fair Employment Agency, and so instead what I do is I tend to stay 3 and 4 years ahead of the organization and try to, like, you know, beat down a path so that the organization can continue to grow, because there are regulatory issues, there are stakeholder issues, and one of them being in this kind of NGO environment, well, it's not just NGOs. I mean, you have governments, you have the United Nations, you have you know, more traditional local or regional NGOs, but then we also have employers, and we also have local governments, and then we have our you know, initial stakeholders, the workers themselves. And all of them have very disparate and sometimes conflicting needs. And so what my job was at the beginning of Fair Employment Agency was to change the way that the entire region talked about human trafficking and migrant labor, because all of the NGOs who I was very, very intimately familiar with because of my legal work with them, and very intimately frustrated with because of my work with them, I mean, they literally would be housed in the same building, 100 steps from each other, funded by the exact same organization, do 80% of the same work, and yet within 10 years had never stepped in each other's offices because they see everything as a zero-sum game, they see everything as you know, competition, and they were not collaborating or cooperating at all. And so what I did was create a quick, I guess, group. We called it the Domestic Worker Roundtable, and created a baseline set of rules. And it was essentially, you cannot advocate for any changes to the law, right? Because what had happened over the period of 3 decades was you were either pro-worker or you were pro-employer. And if you're pro-employer, that means you're pro-government. If you're pro-worker, you're anti-government. And so everything that they were doing, they were constantly fighting with the government. They were saying, you need to change the laws, you need to do this is unfair. And instead I said, look, you cannot advocate, you can do whatever you want outside this room, but when you step in this room, you cannot advocate for the change of the law. And instead what we did, we isolated the focus solely on that one pressure point, the bad agencies. And so over the course of 2 years, we completely changed the conversation that people had about how to solve this issue. And when we did that, when we changed that perspective, all of a sudden the governments were on our side, the UN was on our side, all of the NGOs came along because they realized we were accomplishing things that they were, at least to that point, were unable to. We were sitting and having like cabinet level government discussions with various stakeholders like the Indonesian government, the Philippines government, the Hong Kong government, meetings that they had never been able to pull together before, because now we were on the same side of what used to be a very contentious coin. Now we have the luxury, and I think Poonam is exactly right, we have the luxury of the bad actor not being the government in this instance, right? And so we were able to kind of judo flip the momentum and say, hey, by the way, we all want the same thing. And so why don't you back what we're doing? And we just painted a target on a different actor. And so now because of that, I call it our hub and spoke model of advocacy. I tell our team, we are not an advocacy group. We will never be an advocacy group. We're a systemic solution to this issue. And if people use our services, it's because we're going to be better than everybody else. And if we exist 10 years from now, it's because we're better than everybody else. It has nothing to do with the social mission. And because of that, we are now, I guess, seen as neutral partners that anyone, the government, various governments, I think we're working with 11 different governments right now, 2 or 3 UN organizations, and all of these various NGOs, because all of them come to us thinking we're on their side, even though sometimes we're working like directly counter to their public positions.
Okay, so Karen, how does that look for you, that whole set of problems? Because international human rights law will say that, of course, the governments are responsible for, ultimately, for torture, unlike David's issue. And yet you're engaged with government rather than confronting government. And so how do you reconcile that, and how do you make sure that you're not just engaged in palliative care, but actually transforming systems?
Thank you. I mean, I think going also back to what Poonam said, we need both. right? It's not, is it enough? Is one side enough? It's, you know, opening and keeping the space open for plurality and dissent, and yet at the same time we need both. We also need to move in. I think since the beginning, this has been one of the biggest frustrations for the defenders on the ground. Since the beginning of the work that we've begun, time after time, defenders and lawyers came to us and they said, you know, we can't find any support because all the funders say it's the government responsibility, right? And we kept coming together. I mean, I almost went insane. I live in Geneva, and we have meeting after meeting after meeting about, you know, can we talk about, you know, the right to not be tortured? I mean, this was passed in 1948, right? Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right not to be tortured. We've passed every single thing. And yet we keep having these conferences where we talk about how to make it better, you know, how do we protest better, how do we do this, how do we do that? And actually the laws are there, they need to be implemented. And I think one of the bigger issues where we've had to become creative is that I used to get this response oftentimes from funders who said, it's the government's responsibility, so yes, people are being tortured. Yes, the governments may allow you to come in and us to come in to help support these people by giving them a lawyer, but we can't do it because it's their responsibility. And I think that it's actually ridiculous when you see people being tortured every single day. And we've seen it, I mean, just even recently in Burundi, we had this big, huge, crazy thing because, you know, we had over 100 people who were picked up, tortured. Mothers were calling our office saying, you know, my son's been badly tortured, desperately needs a lawyer. And one of the funders didn't fund us, and when we sat down with them, they said, because we heard that maybe you work too closely with the government. Because one of the Minister of Justice had come to our training at one point, which is the only reason we could stay there. But there was this view that if you're not fighting against the government, if you are working inside the prisons and the police, then you're too close, so we can't support you. And there's a way in which that makes no sense, because who else are you going to support? And they said, well, we actually haven't been able to support anyone else in this situation, but we also couldn't support you because we think you're in bed with the government. And I think that dichotomy in terms of the way that we see things makes no sense if we're going to move forward in this world today. It's about how do we collaborate, how do we talk, how do we come together and say, we want to work together on these issues, whether you're on the good side or the bad side, you know, what part of you will contribute to this and how do we move it forward?
Okay, well, so thank you. So I had one more question to ask all of the panelists, but it's the right time to go to discussion. So the last question was about opportunities in 2017 to exploit in order to help gain ground for civil society. But I'll just throw that open instead, and panelists can come with their thoughts and integrate them into the Q&A. So with that, I'll open the floor for questioning. There's a microphone that's going around if you have a question or a comment.
Yet another lawyer.
Oh my God. And wait, are you wearing blue and gray?
Oh, gray. Blue. It's what they teach you in law school. I'm Mark Wolf. I'm a federal judge in Boston. I'm here in my capacity as chair of Integrity Initiatives International, which is a very new NGO dedicated to advocating for the creation of an international anti-corruption court to hold the kleptocrats who rob their countries of resources that ought to be used for health and welfare of their people, education, accountable, because the existing criminal laws cannot be enforced against them. They control the police, the prosecutors, and the courts. And I want to pick up on some things that Poonam and Karen said, particularly, and then come to a question. And this is civil society under fire, non-governmental organizations under fire. But I've learned over time that the canary in the coal mine is often the treatment of honest judges. As Karen said, frequently there are laws on the books that would keep the space open for dissent. Many countries do not have admirable judiciaries. They have corrupt judiciaries, but they're not monolithic. They have honest judges, and they tend to be persecuted as a forerunner to persecuting members of civil society. So in 2012 and 2013, I was working with a group of honest judges heading the Turkish Judicial Training Academy, trying to make the judges more expert, more impartial, and more independent. The day after the attempted coup in Turkey last July, 2,700 judges were arrested, including my friends and former colleagues. You can't prepare 2,700 arrest warrants in 12 hours in the aftermath of a coup, and it's since been admitted that this list had been prepared for years. The imprisonment of the judges who can't be found, despite my meetings with the Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights, my communications with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Human Rights Watch, among others, was the forerunner for then later imprisoning innumerable journalists and university professors and others who would dissent with a very chilling effect. Similarly, I've experienced in Russia younger lawyers, 25, 45 years old, very courageous, who've been labeled as foreign agents, lost their NGOs, in one case had somebody, Ivan Pavlov's American wife was deported and he almost lost his adopted child. So while this is a session on civil society, non-governmental organizations under fire, there are essential synergies between the judiciary and the members who would enforce the laws to protect civil society and dissent, and lawyers who, Jeremy Bentham said, the law is not made by the judge alone, the law is made by the judge and company. You need lawyers for judges to operate. So what, maybe turning this around a bit, what can civil society do to try to project judges who are striving in embattled circumstances to give integrity to the promise of the rule of law, and to lawyers who are dedicated to trying to make the legal system work for everybody, including those who are under fire in civil society?
That's a hard question. Who wants to answer that?
I mean, I can just sort of briefly say it's something that we really are thinking about. I mean, I think you're seeing the rise of, in a sense, judicial activism in the face of the executive trying to sort of override rule of law. So we've seen it sort of recently in Poland, where civil society has sort of very strongly spoken out in terms of the government's attack on the Constitutional Tribunal court there. I think we've seen it in the US, where, you know, where the judges who've sort of opposed the travel ban, they've also been sort of backed up by mass protests and sort of individual support. And I was speaking to one of our trustees who runs a centre around rule of law, and we were sort of trying to sort of brainstorm and think, you know, what kind of support can be given to those judges? Is it about sort of bringing them out of the country, bringing them together, helping them to strategize, sort of providing solidarity? But sort of beyond that, I think it's something we're still really grappling with. So I'd be sort of very interested to hear kind of your ideas and other people's ideas on how we support those judges that are trying to fight for an independent judiciary.
I think that's part of, actually central to part of what we do, which is we always have roundtable discussions, and we bring in judges and prosecutors and police together with our defenders. And you very clearly see, like in Cambodia, for instance, from the Ministry of Justice, they always sent a prosecutor in. You could see where the support is and also where they're looking for support in different ways. We've often begun our work from civil society contacting us. So for instance, in Burundi, it was a human rights organization that asked us to put up these advisement on rights campaigns. We had no money at the time, but we designed it for them. They put it all up. And then they were going to the judges and prosecutors, seeing which ones would support them and which ones they could begin to work with in different ways. So I think it's some formalized structures like roundtable discussions, and then some of the informal relationships which begin to build.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. Dixon Osborne with the Center for Justice and Accountability in San Francisco. Could you maybe do a deeper dive for us so we get a better sense of what's happening, maybe in India, for example? I know that there's been a huge crackdown there. There were some 22,000 NGOs that were receiving foreign funding. The primary funders were from the US, UK, and Germany to the tune of about $2 billion. That's a significant amount of funding that then is lost because of the crackdown. And India has taken away the registrations, I think, of 9,000 NGOs and placed others on watch lists, including organizations like Greenpeace. So how has this impacted, and I'd say in addition to that, India is a place where I think it was an Amnesty International survey of attitudes toward torture, and the question was, do you fear that if you're arrested by the police, you will be tortured? And India was a place that had a significant response rate of, yes, we think we will be tortured or captured by the police. So how has this impacted either your advocacy, your funding, prior grantees or partners that you've worked with in India? And if India is not the right example, maybe Russia is the right example. I'd just like a deeper dive on what's happening on the ground.
Okay. I think maybe I'll start with a couple of high-level points. But Poonam, are you active in India?
Not at the trust, but I was. So I previously
okay. So we'll ask you to fill in a little bit.
Yeah.
India and Russia are two good examples, but on the other hand, we can also come up with another couple of dozen that are equally good examples. India is a little bit misunderstood in certain ways because of those very compelling facts that are accurate. But one contextual point to bear in mind is that the number of NGOs, although there's been many organizations deregistered in the thousands, the majority of them were not active organizations. So we have to, if we want to really do a deep dive and look at all the nuances, although Greenpeace is under serious pressure and legal cases and so on, in ways that are most likely politically motivated, let's say. And there are many, and there's Lawyers Collective, which is a local organization, long-standing human rights group, which is also in a legal process. So they're very, very important examples. The numbers can be a little bit deceiving because a large number of those NGOs were not active, and the total number of NGOs is enormous in India. When you say 10,000, 15,000 NGOs, it sounds dramatic, but it's a small fraction of the total number of NGOs. It's a very large country. So I just want to make those more nuanced points. But clearly there is something going on in India, and it's partly new and partly not new, because the legislative framework being used, which was amended in 2010, actually goes back to Indira Gandhi and was enacted originally for similar motivations. And I don't think that I'll go into more detail right now because I think Poonam maybe can get to more of the nitty-gritty.
I mean, the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act was was amended in 2010, which was by the previous centre-left coalition, which had sort of generally had a pretty good relationship with civil society and had introduced lots of reforms around things like forest rights, land reform, right to employment, right to welfare. But what they were sort of hitting a barrier with sort of pursuing their economic agenda, which was sort of involved support for kind of multinationals coming in and setting up large infrastructure and extractives projects. And so they had grassroots resistance, giant social movements blocking that. And when they changed the law, what they did was to sort of characterize certain activities as now being political and therefore not eligible for funding from the outside. And those kind of activities were mobilizing workers, mobilizing Dalits, mobilizing farmers, but also characterizing certain strategies as being political. So this is sort of rallies, protests, roadblocks, jail surrounds. I mean, this is like pretty much the bread and butter of what the sort of mass membership groups and movements in India use to raise their voice, because they don't have individually any power. So your power comes from leveraging your numbers. But what you saw happening under the newer government, BJP government that was elected in 2015 now, is that they sort of took that and intensified the crackdown, but also accompanied it with smear attacks. So there was this leaked intelligence report, I think in 2015, which accused sort of handful of environmental groups, but also their funders, of reducing India's GDP by 2 to 3%. And it invoked this idea of sort of foreign agents. My previous role was working for the Fund for Global Human Rights, which funds grassroots groups in many countries, but had a very well-established program in India where we funded mass membership groups working on labour rights, on land and resource rights. So I think what we saw was, yes, they went after the Greenpeaces and the Amnesties, but what was happening at the kind of local level was a sort of chilling effect. Because all of those groups were dependent on foreign funding and they were all up for renewal, and needed to get permission to continue to receive foreign funding, you saw them kind of shutting down and self-censoring and waiting to see if they got their permissions. And when they did all get their permissions, which I thought was a very clever tactic by the Modi government, because they could turn around and say, see, you know, they were all just scaremongering. We haven't stopped anybody getting funding. The kind of, you know, international limelight sort of goes away, and then they start going after those groups one by one. And so that's what we're seeing is, and particularly they're targeting groups that are blocking their economic agenda and groups that are trying to hold the Modi government to account and ministers for past communal violence. And, you know, interesting, you know, one of the things of what's happening in the US is that it kind of eclipses what's happening everywhere else in the world. So you only kind of see the worst practice or the most sort of severe violations by states now sort of breaking through into the international media. So it's Turkey and it's the Philippines. You know, in comparison, kind of Modi looks okay. India looks okay. But the reality is it's not okay. You know, and you have the world's largest democracy, which is shifting towards becoming more intolerant to the point where the governor of the Bank of India, who is not at all a political figure, a couple of years ago said, I'm really worried about rising intolerance. He wasn't specifically talking about civil society, but when it gets to the Bank of the Governor of India, sort of raising of, you know, concerns, that's kind of where we're at in India. And so I do think in India, I think one of the characteristics of the closing space is this idea of contagion. So you see governments looking at what other governments are doing. Russia's a very powerful player, Kenya, Nigeria, India, these hugely significant regional and global players. And when they start cracking down, you see their neighbours going, no one's holding them to account, we're going to do it. So I think India's sort of very important also in the symbolism of India doing this and getting away with it and shifting the idea of what it means to be a democracy.
Yeah, and there's a couple other points that one second, there's a couple other points I'd like to highlight, which is you mentioned Russia. And Poonam mentioned the political activities notion that's built into a lot of these new regulatory efforts. In Russia, that's the case. So if you're an organization and you receive foreign charitable support, and if you engage in quote-unquote political activities, then you have to declare yourself a foreign agent on all of your brochures and literature, a very stigmatizing label, of course, which NGOs resisted. And if you don't do that, then you can be shut down, and many have been. So. But what is political activities? And I think this is a notion that we really need to think about, because you may be getting the impression from the way we're talking about it up here, the way I've presented it, that the front lines of civil society that are under attack are human rights organizations. That may be true in some context, but it's not only human rights organizations by any means. Poonam just mentioned environmental groups, transparency groups, but also just your basic development groups, even conservation groups. So one of the organizations in Russia that was shut down for having foreign-funded political activities was a bird sanctuary. So this is a very, I'm just emphasizing this point because it's a very, we should not be mistaken into thinking this is just a sector of civil society or something that's at risk. This is actually across the board. These are sector-wide attacks on civil society and fundamentally on democratic values.
I think we also thought that you know, things were going to just be awful and terrible, and all activities were going to stop. And for us, one of the things that was so interesting is that number one, they didn't, but number two, we found out how unnecessary, not exactly unnecessary, but it was like it became so strong. And I remember in India, one of our justice makers wrote to me, and I was writing saying, hey, listen, this is a problem because of this and this and this. We can't get funding. And she wrote back to me like, you know, what's wrong with you? She said, Karen, I have learned with International Bridges Justice, and when we were last talking together at our training, to never lose faith. So we are going to just keep on. And you see that we have actually put no money in the last several years. And the activities have been incredible. I mean, luckily for us, we did the national training first in 2008, so they were ready to go. But they figured out within themselves how to find sponsorships within the country. They found, even like Lexus or Westlaw, ones within the country that could publish their manuals. They found really creative ways to actually, and then now, we can't afford to fly, so they'll, don't worry, we'll Skype you in, into this training that we have. But for us, we've seen that.
Okay.
Yeah,
So you're entering the realm of the new solutions, and
Yes,
that's
okay.
great. And those are great points to build on. But I saw a hand in the back before that I'd like to call on.
Hello. My name is Cecilia Flores Ibanda from the Philippines, Visayan Forum Foundation. First, I would like to thank Ed for hosting, for facilitating. I think that this topic is really timely and relevant, as a lot of NGO on the ground is really suffering and under attack. Okay, as you mentioned, it's whole range, because definitely there are crackdowns, there are these perceptions that the NGOs or a lot of NGOs is doing, hocus pocus activities. But in reality, a lot of the NGOs is working in the grounds. The only capital that they have is their integrity and the impact on this of their work. Not all who are accused are guilty. A lot of them were politically motivated. Some of them would like to destroy their credibility and to turn down the impact of the work that they're doing. The problem, our problem in the ground, is that we defenders, no one defend us, okay? When we're accused, no one will defend NGO. The NGO is good in defending others, but there is no movement, or there is no group who's taking care of those who've been defending others to be defended in different levels of this whole ecology of so-called development. Now, the problem is that I think that's actually counterproductive, A lot of NGOs in the ground become really demoralized. And those years of very good experience with just seeing in their own eyes, draining in the ground. And that really demoralize and destroy the impact that they've been worked so hard with sweat and blood.
Yeah,
and
so
tears.
I think that's a wonderful point, and one that we shouldn't lose sight of. Taking it from a high-level perspective, there's 25 years of building incredible social capital, is one way we could call that if we're using an economist frame of mind. Social capital around the world, which might be just going down the drain. Or I don't want to exaggerate too much, but that's what the concern is. That's what we're worried about. So there and then there.
Bankar Roy from the Barefoot College. I've been in the civil society area since 1971 in India. And I think if civil society has never been under fire, there's something wrong. There are layers and layers and periods when civil society will always be under fire. But the trouble, unfortunately, with civil society is we're not one. We're always fighting among ourselves. And we don't have a common face for civil society. I was asked to write the first civil society policy statement for the Government of India in 1984 when I was in the Planning Commission. And there I said we should have a code of conduct for the voluntary sector, for the civil society sector, how we should behave with each other, how we should behave with government, and have a one voice and one forum where we could tackle the government with issues which threaten us. We never got civil society people together because we were always fighting with each other. The rural people wanted the code of conduct, the urban people didn't want the code of conduct, the urban people had good salaries, the urban people had low salaries. Big mess, but I was public enemy number one because they thought I was part of the government. I was close to Rajiv Gandhi, and they said, oh, this chap is Rajiv Gandhi's tool. So anything, it was a mess. But the fact was that we said, civil society have to get their act together. And we haven't been able to get our act together because we have so many ego problems among the civil society leaders that we haven't been able to speak to government with one voice, and they have taken advantage of that all the time. FCRA. 10,000 organized, and when we, and what happened with before Modi's government was, something very revolutionary happened, which Modi's government is still fighting, is that we had a Right to Information Act, which was passed by Mrs. Roy, my wife, but she was under fire. But anyway, the Right to Information Act allowed the civil society people to get lots of information from the government that they didn't want to concede, they didn't want to give, but they had to, under law, give this information. And lots of things came out about voluntary groups and civil society groups who were penalized because of the lack of interpretation of the FCRA Act. For instance, if someone protested against nuclear, they said it is anti-government. When they went on marches, they said it was anti-government. When they said that there was a mining taking place in tribal groups, they said this was anti-government. And we kept on saying this is not anti-government, this is anti-establishment. Please make out the difference between the two. We're not really anti-government, but we are anti this work that is going on. As a result, about 10,000 groups lost their FCRA license because some section officer in a little cubbyhole somewhere in the government of India made a list and no one actually looked at it. And in that list was Ford Foundation, Greenpeace, and everyone was horrified. And the Joint Secretary himself lost his job because they said, what are you doing? You should check your list at least. This man has made it in a little cubbyhole in a little gutter somewhere, and now you've made this into a national embarrassment. But it happened, and even Ford Foundation was on the watching list. Mm-hmm. The trouble was that the civil society just didn't get their act together. FCRA law said you must give your accounts every year. 10,000 of them didn't give their accounts. Of course they will be cancelled. Of course. They said that you have to actually, simple laws that they have to follow, which they didn't follow. And of course my wife piled on to me and said, oh, look at your government, look at what they're doing. I said, if they only actually observe the law of the land, none of the FCRAs will be cancelled. But this happened, and it became a big thing, and then it became very religious. I think Charity International in the U.S. There was some Compassionate International also almost lost their license because of this. Somehow, somewhere, civil society have to come together, forget their egos, and come with one voice, and then they have something to tell the government. We haven't been able to do that in India. I don't know about the other countries around the world, but we haven't been able to get, we've asked for meetings with government, and the government does not see us as one voice. Mm-hmm. This is the tragedy today.
Okay. Thank you for adding that perspective. And we have very little time left, so I'm going to take another question before we turn it back to the panelists. A comment or a question.
David Jones from Microsoft. I'm not a lawyer, and hopefully this is a very easy question. But as somebody who lives and breathes technology every day, I keep asking, like my burning question is, can technology play a role to help here? Do you have thoughts on that?
Okay, yes. But let's get more specific.
Can I address
that?
Yeah,
sure.
Well, so it's interesting because I am very much an outsider in terms of perspective and the way that I address these problems, at least currently. And in a lot of the comments that have been made, and this is certainly not to downplay the risks or the challenges, and definitely not to downplay the impact that civil society has had over the decades, but from an optimistic perspective, I would echo what was said earlier. The reason why governments are opposing many of these initiatives is because they're legitimately scared of the effect and the power that you're having, right? A lot of that comes because they cannot control many of the messages in the ways that they have in the past, right? Whether it's through social media or other things. So the only thing that I would add to the conversation that's been had is, please understand there is so much opportunity in all of the very legitimate complaints that have been addressed here today. And especially if civil society not only comes together, that was the reason I started Fair Employment Agency, because I was so disgusted with the way they didn't collaborate with each other. It just made no sense to me. There was so much overlap in what they did. It was incredibly frustrating. But more importantly, the idea that if you're doing what you're doing the same way that your organization did 10 or maybe even just 5 years ago, you're probably doing it wrong, and you're probably not doing it well. at least not as well as you could do it, right? And technology is not a panacea. Technology is not going to save everything. But there are so many tools out there, and I've been appalled at the way that civil society doesn't integrate business solutions into what they're doing. Again, not just technology, right? Document management systems, client relationship management systems, right? Like utilizing everything, right? Management principles. And it is shocking to me at how much time and how much money is wasted. It's shocking to me. I love what our Michael, the musician, said yesterday. He said, our job is not to convince, it is to connect. And if governments constantly see you as in opposition to them, it's going to be very difficult for us to continue to. Now, there's sometimes we must oppose, right? But again, there's a lot of common ground that can be had. And if you have to oppose the government, then understand there's common ground and communication that can occur within other stakeholder groups, whether they're commercial entities like Microsoft, which brings significant power, whether it's stakeholder bases, grassroots communications, right? Those, you don't have to go through the government or other. The reason President Trump is so powerful is because he doesn't have to go through traditional sources of media, right? He has a direct microphone to the people. And so to the extent we can utilize those things, to the extent that we can really capitalize on those things, I think a lot of your organizations will vastly outpace what they've done in the past, because you're going to find that they're not actually impediments, but springboards in terms of what you want to do.
Okay, do other panelists want, we're almost at the end, so do other panelists want to say anything?
Yeah, just on the technology piece too, that we see this as a huge opportunity for us to actually take the network and give it a home, because more and more there have been different partners who've come across the type of work and have said, we want to give our contribution to the whole. How do we do it? And we see it as, right now we have like 390 partners, so it's like this, this, and this. But there's a way in which, if we're able to place this together on the Justice Hub, and everyone can contribute to it, including governments, if they're willing to put that commitment in, we can move it forward. So I think technology is a huge part of what we see for the future as well.
Okay. Do you want to add anything, Poonam?
I just want to add an example. So I think the points you raised around tensions within civil society are so kind of spot on. And it's part of the reason we see civil society, not just human rights defenders, development groups, we see kind of human rights and development groups at odds with each other, which allows the government to bring in restrictive legislation. I've been in India where I was asked to facilitate a meeting not because I was the best facilitator, but I was the only person everyone in the room didn't hate. So this was around closing space about sort of 3 years ago, and I was like, oh my God, this is not going to work. So I'll give you two very quick examples of where civil society have come together, and we haven't completely fully understood why it's working there and not elsewhere. Kenya. So Kenyan civil society has pushed back against several iterations of restrictive legislation. They've done it by forming a broad civil society alliance between human rights and development organizations and movements. They were able to show, for example, an issue like the HIV/AIDS pandemic could only be addressed with the support of foreign funding and local civil society. They were able to target rural MPs and their constituencies and say, you know what, you are going to be responsible for the decimation of education and health services if you pass this bill. So that's one successful example. Another one, this last one I'll make, is Nigeria, where it's still, there's constant struggle and pushing back against what the government's doing. But it kind of points to the kind of, I guess, the use of technology here. So there you've seen a development of a very broad alliance that also includes faith groups, it includes university students, it includes human rights lawyers. And they've all taken on different roles because they have to be constantly vigilant. So an example is a law was being proposed that would have criminalized anyone that used social media to criticize the government. And it was the lawyers who were vetting all legislation. It was kind of hidden in a bill. They picked up on it. They sent it to the university students, who the only people who had time 24/7 to blog, which those of us in our 30s and above, have other things that we have to do. They were then able to sort of connect with the faith groups who could see how the legislation would also crack down on their ability. And it was a mixture of sort of grassroots, very diverse, civil society movements using social media, using litigation, and they were able to stop that law being past. And I think that's going to be the future. The future is going to be working in alliance and building broad coalitions and using all the allies and all the tools we have to do that.
Great. So just to tie that back to technology and then finish, of course we have to recognize that technology these days provides the tools for expression and association, and these are pillars of civil society. So one thing I think that we need to do is not lose sight of the fact that's obvious, which is that civil society and NGOs are not exactly the same thing. And it's obvious, and yet, in my world anyway, we're constantly forgetting that lesson. So we're stuck in our models, and we have to think a little bit more open-minded and creatively about how to build those alliances. And I'll end on that, and I thank you very much for your attention.